Hello, I'm Cathy Parker. I'm Professor of Retail at Manchester Metropolitan University and I'm the Research Lead for the High Streets Task Force. With non-essential retailing opening on Monday the 15th of June in England, the High Streets Task Force has been keen to collect data and insight from across the consortium and reflect on how high streets are recovering. First of all, consortium partners Springboard have been tracking hourly footfall figures across 160 high streets in England. On Monday the 15th of June, overall footfall across all these towns was 49.4% of the volume it was on Monday the 17th of June 2019, which is the most comparable Monday. Although it was perhaps not quite the bounce back everyone would have liked, it's important to point out that it was the highest daily footfall recorded since lockdown started. Footfall has been as low as 10% of last year's volumes in some locations, so people were returning to the high street to shop. And as other attractions such as personal services, food and beverage remain closed, the uplift can be attributed to the opening of non-essential retail. It was also a nice sunny day which helped, especially for all those people queuing outside Primark. The daily footfall figures for last week may indicate an opening up effect on Monday. Last week, Monday was the busiest day in towns across England, but usually it's Saturday that's the busiest day. And we'll be monitoring footfall closely to see if Saturday returns to being the most popular day for people to go into town. It may not. With so many people working from home, it might be just as easy for them to go shopping at other times during the week. Footfall during the week across all English high streets in our sample was 39.8% of the volume it was during the same period last year. However, whilst we can say recovery is starting, it's certainly not uniform across days of the week, regions, or types of town. Greater London has consistently seen the biggest drop in footfall during the crisis. As London is the busiest city, it always had the most footfall to lose, if you like. And last week, recovery is slower in London than it is anywhere else. It had just 31.8% of the footfall volume seen last year during the same week. And compare that to the West Midlands, which had the highest footfall recovery, with 52.7% of the footfall volumes compared to the same week last year. Taking Greater London out of our sample, footfall last week across England's high streets was 45.4% of the volume it was during the same week in 2019. The lower volumes in London do skew the national picture somewhat, so with London back in the sample, the weekly volume falls to 39.8% of last year's volume. And this variation makes it clear that it's not helpful to lump all towns' footfall together in order to understand what's going on. It's not helpful to talk in averages. We need to be understanding regions and preferably each town on a case-by-case basis. These are the 10 English towns that had the closest levels of footfall to their 2019 volumes last week. And it's a really interesting mix. It's certainly not your typical high street league table. Halsowen, a market town in the West Midlands, had more footfall last week than it did during the same week in 2019. It has a beautiful park, but it's certainly not a major retail destination, and it's only 5 miles away from Merry Hill Shopping Centre. But like quite a few of the other towns on the list, it is a multifunctional town. It serves the local population with their everyday needs. In contrast, Portsmouth is a major shopping destination, but it too had more footfall last week than it did in 2019. It's not possible to be completely accurate with our generalisations, but you won't go too far wrong with these. Last week it was the seaside towns that saw their footfall volumes return more closely to 2019 levels. Perhaps people thought they could combine a trip to the seaside with a visit round any of the non-essential stores that were going to open. The weather was also nice, or at least some of the week. And the smaller multifunctional towns also saw footfall levels return much nearer to the 2019 levels, and these towns have consistently seen more footfall during the COVID-19 crisis. They serve their local population with everyday services, as I said, and I suppose last week a few more of those services and non-essential retailers could open up. We know people have been visiting their nearest local centre more during lockdown, so they may have felt more confident returning there rather than travelling further to a larger centre. It's the big cities, the core cities, that saw lower levels of recovery, and even if some shoppers came to visit the non-essential retail offer, there's still hundreds of thousands of employees, students and tourists that have not yet returned. Interestingly, in contrast to the seaside towns that attracted visitors last week, the inland tourist destinations did not fare so well. And perhaps that's just because the main attraction at the seaside, which is the sea, is open. But many of the attractions in the inland tourist locations like castles and museums and so on, well, they're still shut. So although overall footfall last week was 39.8% of what it was in 2019, as I've said, using overall footfall volumes does mean that the places with the most volume in 2019, like London and the big cities, skew the results. So I've also looked at the average amount of footfall recovery by centre as a percentage. On average, we can say last week a town had 51% of the footfall volume it had last year during the same week. However, the variation in results is pretty big. The standard deviation measures how spread out the results are. Simplifying that a bit more, can say that 80% of English towns have a recovery of between 30% and 70% of the footfall volumes they saw during the same period last year. And I think that's just more evidence to say it's not really helpful to talk in averages. We do need to be understanding each town. If you're not already collecting footfall data, then do consider joining our manual counting regime. It's free and anyone can count. There's more details about it on the High Street Task Force website. The last bullet point refers to our COVID-19 Business Resilience Survey. You can find this survey in the repository if you search using the word survey. The survey enabled us to identify how at risk or vulnerable certain business sectors are to COVID-19, and we've used the results of this survey to calculate an index of how exposed or vulnerable the collective offer of a whole town is to COVID-19. And we've then compared this score to last week's footfall recovery score. And we found a weak negative correlation. The more exposed or vulnerable a town is, the lower the footfall. But it is just a weak relationship, at the moment anyway. Some businesses, like restaurants, may have switched to online and home delivery, and they might be trading well. So we can't assume all restaurants are vulnerable. Again, like with the footfall data, you need to know what's going on in your town. You need to talk to all your businesses and see how they're trading and what their plans are for opening or for the next few weeks or months. I also want to bring some feedback from the High Street Task Force Sector Leaders Group to you. This group represents the trade organisations and industry bodies with a significant stake on the High Street, including bids, local government, retail, hospitality, property, even libraries. You can check out the High Street Task Force website to see who's a member. With non-essential retail opening last week, we were really keen to hear from those who had members who had opened their businesses on the High Street. The British Independent Retailers Association represents lots of small retailers in town centres and high streets, and they said 90% of their members have opened, with 20% seeing better sales than the same week in 2019, and over 2/3 seeing sales of 75% of normal. In contrast, the British Retail Consortium has more larger retailers, and they reported 30 to 70% of normal sales, an average of around 50%. But those larger retailers are likely to be located in the city centres that we've already seen have not got the same levels of footfall recovery as the smaller towns and the seaside towns, where you're more likely to find the independent retailers. There were some positive messages from the market industry too. The National Market Traders Federation said their traders found that the one-way systems that have been implemented to make social distancing easier in markets meant that they had a guaranteed flow of people past their stall, and no matter where they were located in the market. Market customers knew the drill and behaved well, but understandably may have felt more reluctant about shopping in indoor markets. The National Association of British Market Authorities have observed people coming shopping earlier in the day, using contactless, and that many of the people that are returning are the ones that perhaps discovered markets for the first time, doing essential shopping during lockdown. However, there are problems for markets near public transport hubs, as public transport usage is so low. It means that much less footfall for those markets that are nearby. And again, it's important to understand the layout of your town to work out the interaction effects of COVID-19 on the various components. Perhaps you could attract more cyclists, for instance, to the market by installing cycle storage to make it more attractive for people to cycle there. So that's our reflection on last week. It was a really important week for England's high streets as non-essential retail opened. And as we've seen, overall, the early signs are positive. Footfall's returning, people are spending. But just how important last week was to your high street is up to you to find out. Measure footfall, talk to the businesses and the visitors. Everything you find out about your high street will help your recovery and transformation.